The 1998 French Grand Prix, held at the Circuit de Nevers-Magny-Cours, an overrated track in my opinion, would play host to Round 8 of the 1998 Formula 1 World Championship on the 26th to 28th of June. Sporting fever in France was very high at this point, as during this time, the World Cup was being hosted in the country for the first ever time, which would eventually be won by the hosts themselves, which would end up being the first World Cup trophy they would win before winning it again in 2018. Anyways, away from football, this is a motorsport channel. The race had its moments, such as Jos Verstappen, father of Max, making his return to Formula 1, replacing the sacked Jan Magnussen at Stewart. And in his first race back, he decided to celebrate this by stalling on the grid, leading to an aborted start, and allowed the two Ferraris of Michael Schumacher and Eddie Irvine to have a second chance of jumping the two McLarens at the start of Mika Häkkinen and David Coulthard, which in turn led to Ron Dennis being very unhappy after the race and led to Eddie Irvine having a dig at him.
If they were in doubt, then they got to stop it. It's not worth gambling, with people's lives just because Ron Dennis wants to win a race.
Whilst Michael pulled away, the two McLarens would end up fighting Eddie Irvine for second, and the pair would end up messing it up, with Häkkinen going for an ambitious move into the final corner that led to him losing the back end and spinning, whilst Coulthard, after initially passing Irvine into the Adelaide hairpin, had an issue with his fuel rig during his pit stop, preventing any chance he had of finishing second. In the end, it saw Michael Schumacher win the race ahead of teammate Eddie Irvine, and it allowed Michael to close the gap on Mika in the championship. However, what if I told you that this race nearly didn't happen? Here's why. On the 12th of December 1997, and a month after the controversial title decider at Jerez between Jacques Villeneuve and Michael Schumacher, which saw Michael disqualified from the championship and forced to take an FIA road safety campaign, the FIA announced a provisional calendar for the 1998 season, and it featured 16 races that lasted from the beginning of March to the beginning of November. The calendar would once again start off in Melbourne and would finish in Suzuka instead of Jerez, which came in as a late substitute for Estoril in 1997 due to incomplete modifications to the circuit. However, Estoril was scheduled to make a return to the calendar on the 14th to 16th of October to host the penultimate race of the season instead of the finale. However, what many people noticed when the provisional calendar was revealed was the fact that along with Jerez, there was another race that was missing from the calendar. And as you would have gathered by the title of this video, that race was the French Grand Prix at Magny-Cours, and it left a huge gap in between the Canadian Grand Prix at Montreal and the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. So why was the French Grand Prix not included onto the calendar? Well, the reason why was because of TV rights. From the mid-1970s, which was when the first live broadcast of an F1 race took place, all the way up to the mid-2000s, when F1 themselves did all the broadcasts, Formula 1 would get TV stations from the country they were racing at to do the broadcasts. So for example, in the UK from 1976 to 1996, the BBC would do the broadcast and camera work for the British Grand Prix, whilst ITV from 1997 all the way up to the mid-2000s would take over doing the coverage for the British Grand Prix after they won the rights off the BBC to broadcast and show coverage of the Formula 1 World Championship in the UK. Japan, meanwhile, would have Fuji Television do the broadcast for the Japanese Grand Prix, and also for the Pacific Grand Prix, when F1 raced at Tiaida for 2 years, nowadays known as Okayama. Australia would have 9 Network do the broadcasting for them, before switching to Network 10 in 2003, and Monaco would have TMC, not to be confused with TMZ, do the broadcast for the Monaco Grand Prix, and they were the only national TV station to do coverage of F1 until the end of 2022, when F1 finally got the rights to do the broadcast of the Monaco Grand Prix from 2023. Throughout the era of national TV broadcasting for F1, the French Grand Prix would be broadcast by TF1, a well-known French television broadcaster based in Boulogne-Billancourt. Apologies in advance if I butchered that pronunciation. However, in 1997, despite TF1 still having the rights, rival TV network France Televisions, via their channel FR3, disputed this, claiming that they had obtained a judgment from the French courts, claiming that their network, along with all their other channels, were allowed to operate at the Circuit de Nevers-Magny-Cours. TF1, as you might imagine, didn't believe this, as they believed they had exclusive rights to operate at the circuit, meaning no other TV network would be allowed to do so. This, as a result, led to French televisions taking TF1 to court to try and settle the dispute. This, as a result, led to the French Grand Prix not being included on the 1998 calendar, and wouldn't be featured on the calendar unless the dispute was settled. Whilst all this was happening though, there were question marks surrounding two other races on the calendar. These were the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps as a result of a change of law when it came to tobacco sponsorship in Belgium, and once again the Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril due to not having the sufficient funding needed to complete the modifications they were meant to finish in 1997. As a result, there were two races that were brought in as reserve tracks in case these two races were dropped. These were the Chinese Grand Prix at the newly built Zhuhai International Circuit in the Guangdong province of South China, and the other one, and this one will definitely raise some eyebrows, was the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami. Yes, there were talks of bringing South Africa back in 1998, even if it was a reserve race. Thankfully for fans of the Belgian Grand Prix, the organisers, along with Bernie Ecclestone, would be able to agree on a compromise to this new law, which allowed Spa to continue to be on the calendar in 1998. Can't remember what happened exactly in that race. Honestly, can't remember. Nope, still can't remember. However, the same couldn't be said of the Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril, as for the second year in a row, the race would be dropped due to incomplete modifications, which meant there was a 5-week gap on the calendar between the Luxembourg Grand Prix at the Nürburgring in Germany and the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka that needed to be filled by either Zhuhai or Kyalami. And after much deliberation and debate, it was determined that the circuit that would replace Estoril as the penultimate race of the season would be none of them. The FIA decided in the end not to replace Estoril and would instead persist on having a 5-week gap between the Nürburgring and Suzuka. Damn it, we were so close to having South Africa back, and even to this day, we are still waiting for a race in Africa to return. Meanwhile, back with Magny-Cours, and there were disputes between TF1 and FR3 about the TV rights for the French Grand Prix. So much so that these debates would still continue even after the first race had concluded at Melbourne, which featured that controversial swapping of the cars between Mika Häkkinen and David Coulthard. Eventually though, on the 19th of March 1998, 10 days before the second race of the season at the Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos, the FIA World Motorsport Council announced that the French Grand Prix would be reinstated on the 1998 calendar for the 26th to 28th of June after the dispute between TF1 and FR3 had been settled as a result of the French Parliament adopting a law which clarified the rules on TV coverage, specifically coverage regarding the French Grand Prix. As a result, the calendar once again featured 16 races, and everything for the 1998 season had finally been settled. Although this video was mainly talking about how the French Grand Prix nearly didn't feature on the calendar, when you look at the 1998 calendar as a whole, it could have looked very weird if certain races didn't happen. Given the confusion surrounding the French, Belgian and Portuguese Grand Prix, we nearly ended up in a situation where, because the reserve tracks at Zhuhai and Kyalami were not utilised, we could have ended up with only 14 races on the calendar. And given we now live in a time where the biggest complaint about F1 is the fact that there are too many races on the calendar, along with too many street tracks, there could have been a point where back in the late 90s there may have been complaints saying there were not enough races on the calendar. How much of an irony would that have been? Formula 1 would continue to race at Magny-Cours until the end of 2008 when the French Grand Prix was dropped in 2009. The Grand Prix wouldn't feature again until 2018 when F1 made its return to the unpopular Paul Ricard circuit in Le Castellet. Unpopular opinion, I actually prefer Paul Ricard over Magny-Cours. Not that I like Paul Ricard, by the way, I just prefer it over Magny-Cours when it comes to racing. F1 would race 4 times at Paul Ricard from 2018 to 2022, with 2020 being the only season during that time not to host a race there due to the pandemic at the time, and it would get dropped at the end of the 2022 season, meaning at the time of recording, the French Grand Prix is once again not featured on the F1 calendar. The Belgian Grand Prix, meanwhile, despite being off the calendar for 2003 and 2006 for separate reasons, is still on the F1 calendar today, although if Liberty Media gets its own way at the end of 2025, there's a chance that this magnificent circuit could be gone as well. As for Portugal, Estoril would not host an F1 race again. However, the country would welcome back F1 in 2020 at the popular Portimao circuit during the pandemic, and would once again host the Portuguese Grand Prix in 2021 as things were slowly getting back to normal. Since 2021 though, F1 has not visited Portimao or even Portugal again. So really, when you look at the 1998 calendar as a whole, thank God we didn't end up having a depleted calendar. Although, I am still slightly gutted that we didn't go back to Kyalami when Estoril was dropped. Seriously, we need a race down in Africa.